Here are the notes for day 13. Day 13 is operations on imaginary and complex numbers. We've done imaginary numbers before. Anytime you try and square root a -1, we turn that into the imaginary number I. So for -25 underneath the square root sign, separating it down into factors, -1 times 5 times 5. The square root of 5 squared is just 5, so that comes out. And then the square root of -1 is I, and I'm left with 5i. If you have negatives underneath the square root where the numbers don't simplify, like this example, -26, -1 simplifies into I, but then 13 times 2 doesn't have a pair of numbers that are the same, so that stays underneath the square root, and I have I on the outside and root 26 on the inside. Imaginary numbers also show up in what's called complex numbers. If I take a real part and an imaginary part, I have what's called a complex number, and they're used quite a bit in computer science and a little bit in Photoshop. We're not going to be doing that type of material, but complex numbers behave just like terms. So if I have A is 1 plus 2i and B is the complex number 3 minus 5i, and if I want to add those two complex numbers together, I find they're similar or they're like terms. 1 and 3 are like terms, which totals to be 4, and 2i minus 5i is -3i, which is the second half of our complex number answer. Subtraction is just the same, but as usual, instead of subtracting, I want to add the opposite, and because there are two terms in the complex number here, that negative gets sent to both of them. So my terms are 1 plus 2i, and then change of sign for both these terms, a -3 and a +5i. So now my common terms are 1 minus 3, which is -2, and 2i and a 5i, which is 7i. So again, subtraction of complex numbers is the same as adding variables and like terms. Finally, multiplication. We know how to FOIL out binomials. So complex number has two terms, complex number has two terms. We need to FOIL those four terms. 1 times 3 and 1 times -5i produces these two. 2i times 3 and 2i times the -5i produces these two. Now what changes is 3 gets brought down. Combine your like terms into a +i, but I squared really represents -1. If I equals the square root of -1, then I squared equals -1. So now I squared, which is -1 times -10, becomes a +10, which is a like term with 3. So 10 plus 3 is 13, and my final simplified answer is 13 plus I. Anytime you multiply complex numbers, you're going to have an I squared, which means you're going to have another number that gets added to the first term. Okay, that's it for complex numbers. Practice these. There's lots of short little questions. It looks like a lot, but it's not so bad.